Great, we'll get started. Hi, everyone. My name is Ben Gargano, and I am an associate at Goldman Sachs. As someone who is very engaged in and passionate about the real estate tech sector and a longtime follower of CREtech, I am proud to be serving as the MC for today's webinar. Having guest MCs like myself is another terrific way the CREtech team is supporting and encouraging the next generation of real estate tech leaders. Before we get to today's webinar, I'll quickly touch on some upcoming events that CREtech is hosting on September 29th through October 1st and October 7th and 8th. Join CREtech for the Reimagining Real Estate Sustainability Summit, a two-part virtual event focused on the timely and important issue of sustainability in real estate. Attendees will hear from the leaders on the forefront of creating healthier, safer buildings and cities throughout the entire built world, including corporate professionals, real estate companies, investors, technology companies, and government leaders. And don't miss CREtech's other upcoming events from IOTAS on September 17th and a preview of our Sustainability Summit featuring event co-chairs Lindsay Baker and Brendan Wallace on September 22nd. You can also check out CREtech.com/events for a full list of upcoming events. And now to today's webinar. CREtech is proud to introduce their new webinar series focused on its global innovation consulting practice. Each month, CREtech will take a deep dive on an important trend in the world of real estate technology and innovation. These themes are carefully selected and researched by their world-class team of consultants and advisors. In the second CREtech Consulting Talks webinar, several of our world-class consultants and guest speakers will discuss how COVID-19 has caused corporations, tenants, residents, and developers to rethink their entire approach to work and placemaking. The massive disruption in the built world caused by the pandemic will have far-reaching and lasting impact on how spaces are designed, built, and occupied, as well as how cities are transformed as a result. Our leading experts from the world of smart cities and buildings, architecture, design, and construction will take the long view on how the entire physical world of commercial real estate will be transformed in both the short and long term. These and many other topics will be discussed by our leading consultants, advisors, and guest speakers in this future-focused webinar. With that, I'll turn it over to Emily Wright to introduce the guest speakers.
Thank you very much, Benjamin. Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us here today. I was about to say this afternoon. I don't mean that. I'm phoning in from London, where it is this afternoon, for this CREtech Consulting Talk webinar. I'm Emily Wright, Head of Special Projects and Tech Editor of the States Gazette, based here in the UK. And what a big topic it is that we're looking at today. I mean, reimagining cities and the entire built world. I mean, the fact that the word entire is in that topic heading there is sort of proof enough that this is a huge topic that we're addressing. As Benjamin said, our panelists are going to be discussing how COVID-19 has caused corporations, tenants, residents, and developers to rethink that word entire approach to work and placemaking, and of course cities and everything that goes along with that and supports it. Luckily, we have a stellar lineup of speakers joining us today who are more than equipped to take on a topic of this magnitude. So let me introduce them. We're joined by Greg Lindsay and Devon Vermeulen, both consultants for CREtech's Global Innovation Practice. Greg, of course, a cities expert and senior fellow at New Cities, and Devon, former creative director of WeWork and now interim head of product at Getaway and an expert on all things flex, which is going to be something we're definitely going to be talking about today. And we're also joined by Roger Smith, design director of global design and architecture firm Gensler. So three brilliant panelists, all raring to go, I believe, to discuss this huge topic. And before we get into the real nitty-gritty of it all, and don't worry, we will. I'd really like to just spend a minute or two hearing from each of our panelists on how they are, so how you guys are, how things are going. We started doing sort of webinars a few months ago where that question had a bit of a different slant to it, but I still want to find out how people are doing. Are you guys back at the office yet? If not, when do you think you might be back? And then also just a very brief overview as to why this huge topic is so close to each of your hearts. So Greg, let's start with you if we may.
Yes, well, it's a pleasure. Good to see you, Emily, and good to see everyone here, and thank you all for having me. I'm here in Montreal. So here in Montreal, the fall is already well underway. And of course, Canada has been relatively spared from the pandemic in terms of overall numbers. So there's a veneer of normalcy here. My children are in school. I'm not back in an office. New Cities is a small think tank. We're one of those organizations that's gone post-office. We let our lease expire, put our things into storage, and we're going to wait until conditions, I don't know, improve more, I suppose. But yes, how am I doing? Deep Zoom fatigue, Emily. That's how I'm doing here. And that's why I question anybody who's out there saying that like working remotely forever is the right thing to do. Because I think, and then I'll pass it over to my panelists here, but it's interesting. I worked from home for 15 years. I've been a freelancer in all things. And the difference between now and then, I think, is basically about a lot of agency. And it is this sort of norm here for video calls. Organizations desperately trying to strengthen already strong ties with their employees as a way to make up for that lack of physical presence. So yeah, it's like my schedule is more full than ever and more fatiguing than ever. And I'm having so many great conversations, but yeah, there's incredible mounting cognitive costs that I still feel organizations haven't reckoned with. And the office itself seems like a relaxed pace. I can go in there and, goof off and do other things versus the always on demand here. So we can get into that here, but having a physical container for work where I can leave and go home, that sounds so appealing right now.
You certainly make it sound very appealing, and yeah, it's something that we're definitely going to come on to. And Zoom fatigue, it's a thing, it's 100% a thing, yeah, I feel like everybody is, if they weren't there several weeks or months ago, certainly getting there now, but not on this call, of course. We'll very much enjoy joining via Zoom. Roger, over to you. Your thoughts, please.
I'm very glad to be here. I'm in New Jersey, one of the places that was hit the hardest from the pandemic, but managed to sort of manage that process well, and the numbers are coming down, and the state generally is doing well. I think well poised to sort of come back in a strong way. As I said, I'm in New Jersey. It's exciting here in terms of in terms of the opportunities that I think are here. And I'm looking forward to our discussion because I think there are things that have come out of this incredible event, this incredibly tragic event, that will be positive opportunities for us moving forward. In terms of my interest in this topic, I mean, I'm a member of the Gensler Global Research Group, and we've been focused on cities for a while now in some depth. And so, our focus was on shaping the future of cities. And now I think we're impacted by these events, and we're redefining, I think, what cities need to be. And this discussion is a part of that mix. So I'm happy to be here today. I'm excited about it. I'm excited about the discussion. It is a big topic, but I think we need to be thinking about this at the larger scale here.
Thank you very much. And finally, Devin, your thoughts.
Thanks. Yeah. Also very excited to be here and happy to be part of CREtech's crew. And I'm kind of in a weird position because in October, my wife and I welcomed our second child into the world, which was really amazing. And around that time, we decided to relocate across country from New York to Atlanta to be closer to our extended family. And then that coincided with me parting ways from WeWork. And so I already was kind of going through a pretty massive disruption / change in my life. And then it kind of felt like the whole world sort of like jumped in and kind of came with me. And then all of a sudden my changes didn't feel quite so important and massive as the changes that we are all participating in. So I'm down here now and happy to have a little bit more space and nature to be around now that I'm working from home. I'm kind of working for myself and I'm internally posted up with a company, Getaway, right now as their head of product. We got rid of our office space shortly after COVID and kind of have been transitioning to, at least for now, fully remote workforce. We're kind of doing a lot of research into sort of what that means for our culture and how we can, improve that and make sure that we kind of don't lose a lot of productivity and sort of happiness and kind of employee efficiency along the way. And excited to kind of, in that regard, sort of be part of that conversation. And then personally, as I've been going through changes and looking for new adventures, this kind of has become a precipice for society, and these kind of big moves that sort of affect all of us, I think, are really great opportunities for us all to step back and say, hey, before we go back to normal, like, let's revisit normal, like what was working for us, what wasn't working for us. And I think with cities especially, there are so many things that kind of just became ubiquitously like part of the fabric of cities that weren't really any longer having root in kind of like making people happy or making people's lives easier or better, and that hopefully we can kind of re-look at kind of what we go back to through that lens a little bit stronger.
Thank you very much, and many congratulations to you. It sounds like it's been a very interesting 2020 for you.
A lot of action.
So before, I mean, I wanted to sort of look into some of the issues that we're going to look at specifically in a minute. But before we do that, I wanted to ask each of you sort of a more broad question, really, which is whether you feel like the issues that we're facing in terms of change and transforming cities, whether that be, workplace or culture or retail or mobility, whatever it might be, and we'll get into that in a minute, is this and all these changes, how new are they? Because there's no doubt that a lot of stuff is being accelerated. I mean, I think that that's something that people would say about a lot of things off the back of this pandemic. It's accelerated a lot of stuff that was kind of already in the wings and already sort of ticking over. And I'm interested to find out whether you guys think that this situation with cities and all these changes is more of an acceleration of what was already happening, or whether we're actually seeing some new issues raised as a result, or maybe it's a mixture of the two. That's a very long question, isn't it? So who should I spring that on? Roger, you're laughing.
Well,
so.
I certainly, there's a lot there, and we clearly don't have enough time to really get into that fully, but I would say that, in many aspects, I mean, we've looked at a number of different aspects of the city. We've looked at issues of climate, we've looked at housing, we've looked at mobility, which is a critical component, and we've looked at this notion of technology and connectivity, which is all really important. And in almost all of those areas, there is a trend, the trend is moving forward. And as you say, certainly being accelerated. But from the standpoint of climate change, for example, it's one of the most pressing issues that we had before. And it continues to be one of the greatest challenges that we have in our cities. So I think that's something we're going to have to really think about. I think that the acceleration of that response is going to be critical to that. I mean, there's no doubt. I mean, many people know that over 40% of the greenhouse gases are created by our buildings, and that our cities across the globe represent, 90% of them are represented on coastal land. So you can imagine that the response needs to be fairly dramatic across the board. So I think that certainly has to be a priority. I imagine too that there are tremendous opportunities here. Yes, we do need to respond. That response needs to be more accelerated than ever. But there are also opportunities. I mean, for example, we anticipate it by 2030 that there'll be about 2.5 trillion more square feet of building, okay? That means if we think sustainably, we can actually make a substantial difference and make an impact. I mean, at the Institute, we did a evaluation of our projects, for example, and over the last year, we did about 1.25 billion square feet of building. And we assessed what the sustainable impact of that was. And it was essentially to save about, I think, 11 million metric tons of CO2 during that year. Okay, so that's just our organization. Imagine what we could do if we really mobilize the entire industry to make these kinds of substantial changes. And what if we mobilize our cities to make the same kinds of commitments to changing our impacts on the climate? I think that's one of the overarching issues that I think is so critical, and it's the first of many that we have to address in our cities.
Thank you very much. Greg, I'm going to come on to you. And just before I ask you to comment, I'm going to say something I meant to say and I forgot at the beginning. So many apologies to everybody, which is that we will be taking questions from our audience towards the end of this discussion or throughout if questions come up that are relevant. So please do ask your questions in the chat function on your screens, and we really welcome that. And I did mean to say that. So Greg, that question to you as well, you know, either off the back of what Roger's already said or whether you had some thoughts to add.
Well, lots of thoughts here, and I'll save some for Devin here, who particularly I want to hear his thoughts on workspaces, because, you know, as we can get to, like, and this, I'll back up here. Two big trends immediately come to mind. I'll build off climate change and sustainability and Roger's point in a second. But obviously, to me, the biggest thing that's going to come out of the immediate pandemic is work from anywhere becomes permanent. Overnight seismic shift accelerating what it would have taken a decade or more. Again, I'm not a believer that we're all going to work from home from anywhere, but like now we can finally get to thinking about work as happening in a portfolio of spaces that can happen at different urban densities and scales. And we're already starting to see, you know, very large occupiers start to rethink having permanent leases and start thinking about their flexible portfolio, which I will let Devin handle in depth there. So that's a huge one. And that gets into, and that can be both an incredible positive and a negative, because as part of that, we're also seeing the so-called K-shaped recovery, where for white collar workers who already live in, you know, in nice communities that are funded, you know, this is a huge opportunity for them to live more local lives, reduce commutes, et cetera. It's also, of course, you know, accelerating the inequality for communities of color who, you know, who basically have been pushed back to the center by the protests against George Floyd's killing by police and the subsequent killings by police in the United States, to really underscore how these communities have been marginalized and their health impacted. We see that, of course, you know, with the incredible fatality rates in African-American communities in the States. So, you know, that's been pushed back to the forefront about how we sort of built racism and inequality into our built environment. And that is a massive decades-long project we will need to fix. And then I guess the last thing I want to touch upon, yeah, Roger was on the you know, the upside of sustainability. I mean, the downside is I mean, California is on fire. The West is on fire. I think we're just beginning to live through what William Gibson, the science fiction author, has called the jackpot, which is the sort of corresponding crises of climate change and pandemics that are causing us to have the sort of growing spiral of problems. And I think, for example, of families that fled the Bay Area where they couldn't afford the housing and decided they weren't going to do it. So they moved to the Sierra Nevadas, and now they fled back to the city because the Sierra Nevadas are on fire. And these are going to be the kind of widening problems that we're going to have, these truly wicked problems that we're going to need to solve. And just as a point, a way of solving them, at the same time that's happening in California, the state legislature voted down literally at midnight, at the 11th hour, a proposal to allow you to build not one home on a single family plot, but just two. If you could just build 2 homes on a single plot of land. And that was too much for the homeowners of California. So there's huge policy changes that still need to happen before we can even begin to employ the technology that really the CREtech community, technology and innovation and creativity that the CREtech community can bring to bear. We still have not made those breakthroughs policy-wise yet.
Thank you very much, Devin. There's a lot there from Roger and Greg, and you know, these huge. I mean, I thought that the topic of discussion was massive, but you know, when you start delving into the issues themselves, they're kind of bigger than even the topic title suggests. I mean, where do you stand on all of this in terms of some of the issues that really need to be addressed first and foremost?
Yeah, I think, you know, what, you know, to your original question, like a lot of the things that we're looking at right now are things that were already happening, but the pandemic has kind of bubbled them up into, you know, kind of where we can't ignore them anymore, and sort of like put a really lens on a lot of these things, you know, inequality, you know, in terms of people of color, in terms of socioeconomic status, like we're seeing how the COVID is affecting them heavier. Obviously, George Floyd is making everybody kind of revisit the, you know, systematic racism that we've all kind of, I don't want to say look the other way, but in many ways kind of just allowed to happen on everybody's watch in this country for so long. And I think that is one of, you know, obviously one of the biggest, but one of many of these kind of things that sort of were happening and nobody was really happy with, but we all just kind of said like, well, you know, that's just kind of how it is. And we kind of kept going about our days. And even things as simple and kind of simple as traffic and kind of commuting and dealing with traffic on the way to work, you know, people all of a sudden realized, you know, hey, when I don't have to go into work every day and then there's no more traffic and you know, not only are we cutting down emissions in that sense, but like I'm getting back an hour of my day that I used to, you know, kind of dread spending, like sitting in the car and trying to distract myself. Now we're starting to say like, well, hey, well, maybe we don't have to go back to that the way it was, you know, and start looking at, you know, the work from anywhere concept, how do we kind of retain some of the things that are better, under the pandemic, while we mitigate some of the things that are worse. I think it is kind of one of the questions we have to ask ourselves. And in terms of workplace, just jumping into that because Greg kind of teed me up. I think if you look back in the history, a recent history of kind of workplace strategy and kind of how we look at workplace culture, things that have already been aiming towards the worker themselves and looking at how do we make them happy, how do we make them productive, how do we look at compensation as more than just a dollar sign, but kind of a fulfillment of kind of being happy to get up in the morning and kind of start your day. And when you look at what COVID's done and kind of like, we were previously talking about like pushing towards things like activity-based working and kind of a place for everything. And rather than saying, this is your desk, this is your chair, you come in and you sit here and then you work for 8 hours and then you go home, saying, hey, here's a phone booth, here's a conference room, here's a lounge space, here's these other kind of like postures that you can take, whether you're meeting in groups, whether you're working individually. And the home has just become a natural extension of that, or should become a natural extension of that. If you're most productive there, then that should be where you're able to work. And then when you start thinking about anywhere now, we're kind of giving people more choice, more ability to kind of take responsibility and control their day to day, and judge them more by their work and their output rather than kind of traditional kind of helicopter management of sort of like, I'm looking over your shoulder and watching what you're doing in this chair, for 8 hours.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, just to add a bit to that, I think it's fascinating that during this period, that many of the organizations that didn't necessarily embrace technology in the way that they're doing now have basically had a breakthrough. They now see that it's possible to allow the workforce to work from home efficiently. And actually, we found there's a number of incredible efficiencies in doing this. But there's also the cultural aspect of an organization. There's the social interaction between people. That's an incredible part of the functioning of a city, of course. And those have to be woven into the conversation, no doubt about it. And it is amazing as well that this crisis has revealed so much. We talk about the social injustice that has happened over the decades in this country for years, and that now people are more aware of those sort of institutionalized policies that have held people back. And I think it's interesting because now that we're kind of focused on those broader issues of inequities in cities, we're sort of searching for a kind of balance, I think. This idea of kind of fairness, whether it's in the workplace, in terms of having the ability to and the agency to work from home some of the time and work from the office and other times, where you can kind of come together and convene. I think it's an interesting moment for us. It's a moment where I think there are tremendous opportunities. One of the outcomes, for example, in recently as a result of the pandemic, was that the automobiles on the road reduced dramatically. And there's an amazing image of Beijing before the pandemic and a few weeks after the pandemic. And just a few weeks after the pandemic, the skies were clear. And there have been similar studies in Manhattan and other areas that suggest to me that this sort of negative impact of the pandemic also has a kind of positive side, which is to suggest, or at least open up the possibility for people, that we can actually make this dramatic change, this really important change that has to happen quickly if we make that decision. And that's just one example of that.
Yeah, I think when you look at, and this is by no means to sort of lower the impact of the pandemic, but there are lots of things that were occurring, like pollution and things like that, that were kind of just, we didn't stop everything and say, hey, everybody, nobody go to work anymore because because traffic deaths are a problem, because pollution is a problem, because a number of things that are sort of not an issue right now during the pandemic. And I think it's kind of behooves us to say like, hey, look, let's not just like go back to like just saying, hey, well, that's just the way it was and let's accept it. But like, let's not go back to that. Let's find a solution before we go back.
But I just want to jump in one more thing here. I like, the word opportunity comes up, and I think it's also fair to say this is more of an inflection point because there are positive and negative outcomes of this. You know, the flip side, Roger, your point about, you know, the skies clearing over Beijing when there was no traffic. Well, we've already seen rebounds back to pre-COVID levels and it increases on top of that. And you know, you take that fact and you pair it with the fact that, you know, just the transition from cars to SUVs over the last decade has been the second single largest source of carbon emissions according to the IEA, like just because we're driving light trucks now. So yeah, so I worry, you know, as part of these narratives, you know, the so-called COVID flight from cities, right? You know, if people actually do try to get large single lot, you know, homes out of the exurbs and start driving SUVs because of fear of contagion and they want a cocoon, well, you know, I mean, I've taken to quoting Robert Frost's, you know, fire and ice a lot, you know, I mean, some believe the world will end in fire and some believe in ice. Like, do you believe that we're gonna end in climate change if we go back to normal, or do you believe we end in ice if we stay in lockdown forever? And these, you know, this is the kinds of things. So yeah, getting back to everyone's point here is like, there's an opportunity here to really sort of change the narratives, but I'm afraid many organizations haven't had that breakthrough yet. I think a lot of orgs are ditching their offices because they see cost savings, and I'm afraid that people are being scared to not take public transport or live densely because of the so-called fears of contagion. So we still have plenty of work to do, and that's probably why it's important why we're having this conversation.
Yeah. I mean, there's no doubt but I think in the end, the city does offer an opportunity, clearly. A lot of people would suggest that the city, people are moving from the cities, and that will be the detriment of cities. No, I don't think so. I think there's always going to be a kind of vibrancy in those cities. I mean, and there's you know, cities, the diversity of cities, the economic vitality of the cities, you know, drives economies, right? You know, over 80% of the global GDP is produced in our cities. That means something's happening there. But also innovation is happening there. People are interacting with each other. People are learning new things. There's a concentration of infrastructure. There's a concentration of thought leadership in these places. And there's sort of a community of innovation that exists in our city that I think we're certainly going to need to tap into in order to move these things forward. You know, and I think that sort of understanding of the city, I mean, we know that the population is going to grow tremendously. We know it's over 50% of the population is in our cities now. And we know by 2050 that will go to 70%. I don't think those numbers are going to dramatically change. I think that migration is still going to continue. So we have to be ready for it, and we have to take on the challenge to do something about it. And I think that may mean thinking in innovative ways about community. You know, what's it mean to be in a community? What does it mean to go to the workplace? Wouldn't it be interesting instead of you know, work from home? What if it's, you know, walk from home, right? What if we have this opportunity to kind of create density and a mix of uses where people can work from home and walk a very short distance down the block to their office, or even in the same building, for example? And what if there's an opportunity or a proximity to open space and outdoor space that we've also seen a real migration to and a real appreciation for, which we hadn't seen in the past. So I do think I am optimistic because I think there are opportunities, but I think, Greg, you're absolutely right. There's going to be a tendency to shift back to the way it was. And I think there's tremendous opportunity in moving us forward in a different way.
I mean, something that I just want to touch on there is that, you know, those points, and that was great that you guys really sort of bounced off each other there, and there's so much there. But it would just be, I mean, and I don't know whether it's possible on this call, or even this year, or even this decade to answer this question. So I apologize, because I'm going to ask you guys. But what is that, you know, if there's no clear answer, obviously, but what is the kind of all-encompassing sort of strategy that people need? Because when I'm hearing you talk, it's like, well, there's this. I'm like, yeah, and it's like, but then there's this, you know. So you've got this situation where it's like, you know, on the climate side of things, look at the clear skies, but we need to get people back, and then we need to get people back, but do people feel safe doing that? And then it would be great if we could get people confident enough to be back on public transport, but what needs to happen for that then to go forward? And then you can kind of end up in this sort of like perpetual cycle of, you know, but then this is the, you know, and then you just get to Greg's Robert Frost, you know, fire or ice, neither of which are hugely appealing. So is there, you know, a kind of an approach that people need to take, whether that be, you know, as simple as just being innovative and open to new thoughts and ideas, or is it, you know, more citywide discussion? Is it, you know, more global sharing of ideas? What is it that we need to do that we haven't been doing before to kind of cut through all of that? And it's another horribly long question. Oh, Greg's jumping in.
We'll turn it to fire and ice if you'll let me go first. So two models. So one of them, the hot model out there discussion is, and I had a call this morning with the deputy mayor of Milan, Pier Francesco Moran. You know, they in Paris are advocating this notion of the 15-minute city, or what we in DC call the proximity city, which is the notion, to Roger's point, of a life that is lived within a 15-minute radius on foot or on bike from your home. And what's interesting about that is, you know, it kind of flies in the face of urban economics, right? Like, to really maximize the potential of a city, as Roger pointed out, like, you need to be able to live and work anywhere within it. And that's why we build mass transit. And that's why we have the huge urban cores of Manhattan. Well, you know, to make a 15-minute city work, you really need to make the real estate then and all the assets work double, triple, quadruple overtime, because they have to constantly morph into all the uses you would need. And this gets back to really the heart of CREtech, really, and sort of the prop tech phenomenon of what we can do to make more mixed use reusable spaces. So that is an interesting idea. And to do that, to make that a reality, you also need to have a policy change, because you really need to have you know, protections put in place for the delivery workers. You really need to have like a sort of a new deal, not to get too grandiose there, but a new deal for remaking that economy to, you know, prop up and invest in public transport, for example, because they'll no longer have the commuters going to the urban core, so they will never make it back on fares. So unless you want the MTA in New York to collapse, you'll have to, you know, effectively bail them out and restructure how that works. So that's one thing. And then the second thing is, you know, I'm working on a project right now on climate migration and what's called managed retreat, which is a phrase that everybody involved is trying to change. But it's the recognition that we desperately now need to understand what are the limits of where we can build and live, and start building new, more resilient districts, either away from the coasts or away from forest fire areas, or perhaps around the Great Lakes, or think about what the sort of new spatial fix of our era will be. And, you know, and I bring this up because just this morning, the Trump administration's, you know, Commodities Future Trading Commission just put out a 200-page report highlighting systemic risks to the financial sector due to climate change and subsystemic risks, particularly to real estate assets and the 30-year mortgage because of this as well. So there needs to be an understanding about, you know, we need to build more to replace what we're going to lose on the coast. And again, this, to Roger's point earlier, and Devin's, is a perfect opportunity to build those kind of more sustainable districts. We just have to identify where, and we have to, you know, basically sort of make those changes. So instead of fire and ice, I give you 15 minutes and, you know, and the new resilient inland city.
Yeah, I was really, I feel like in some ways, Greg stole my initial answer, which is essentially, I mean, one of the big things is mixed use. I mean, I was having conversations like 3 years ago with activists in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, about trying to get the city to build incentives for commercial real estate there and for office space and for other space, because, you know, when it comes down to it, you think about a city of New York as like, oh, it's a city, it's dense, but like, it's really a series of kind of residential suburbs and then kind of urban centers, and people are commuting. And there was a question in the chat about how do we get people to be comfortable, or do we build unlivable cities because we're relying so much on public transportation? And you know, especially those of us that are very sustainable minded have been champions of public transportation for so long as you know, a solution to climate change. But, you know, it doesn't mean that we have to, everybody has to take it. The best solution is that people can walk to work, or that, you know, the place they live is also the place they work. And so they're not spending all this time traveling to and from. And what I think COVID has kind of allowed us is there's been a lot of talk and a lot of buzz about the concept of the third space, and thinking about like, okay, my company may have an office in the city, I may have a home here, and those two things may not change, but there may be the emergence of this third space, that whether that's kind of you know, a collaborative office space that's in, you know, Main Street of the suburbs, whether that's like something that's part of my multifamily residential building. I think there's going to be a lot of growth in this sector of finding somewhere that mitigates our, you know, I don't want to be home because maybe I understand now, you know, very clearly the problems of working from here every day, day in, day out. I've been in the office for so long, I understand those problems. Like, now we need to find a new solution that kind of mitigates both, and that's where I think the emergence of this concept,
yeah,
kind of take off.
Well, also, I mean, I would add just broadly to answer your question, that it is a difficult task, and it is it's sort of hard to wrap your brain around what needs to be done to solve all of these problems. But certainly, the first thing we have to do is respond to this pandemic. So I think that's what we're doing. I mean, we're finding retailers right now making sort of local response to the issues at hand. You have the click and collect method of getting things out there. You're seeing a transformation among retailers to really kind of reinvigorate and reimagine what that retail space can be virtually, right? And so that's the first step, sort of responding right now to deal with the problem so that you don't lose your shirt. But beyond that, that you can kind of innovate and discover things that you may not have discovered before. So that's one. The second thing you really have to do, because the pandemic is not going to end in a snap, right? It's going to continue for a while. And there are going to be different phases of the pandemic that we have to deal with. So we're really going to have to continue, each of us in our own realms of influence, to reassess during this pandemic and sort of reassess the assets we have, reassess the current state of our culture, our communities, and sort of understand that as we go, all in a kind of goal, in my mind, to reimagine what the city can be. Because I think we've got to do that. I mean, this is not only a crisis, it's an opportunity to reimagine the future.
That's a great point, and I'm really interested in how much you all believe that real estate and developers and, I mean, architects as well, obviously, but developers in the real estate sector, how much, and, apologies for sort of making you look at it from a bit of a broad brush perspective, but how much is the sector behind this? Because what we're talking about currently is sort of a very, it's more embedded in kind of a cultural shift in the way that people behave and what people want. But the real estate sector has to respond to that for it to be a success story either way, whether it's the changing requirements for office space or the changing requirements for retail. So to a degree, how far ahead real estate is in terms of dealing with this will play a huge role in how fast we get there and how successful it is. So, Greg, let's start with you. How behind this do you think real estate is? And also, again, a very long question, is it an enforced support of like, oh, well, we're going to have to do it now because look at the situation we're in? Or is it something that you think that the sector, feels passionately about?
I was going to say, when you said behind, I was trying to parse, do you mean trailing behind, or do you mean like forcefully?
No, it's in like,
It is, I say, because I would say that they're trailing behind of this. I mean, yeah, I think they're coming around to this and yeah, I mean, I'm glad I don't have major leases on real estate in the core of Manhattan, because I do think, although I'm extremely doubtful of flight from the city narratives, like, like San Francisco proper and Manhattan do appear to be the two that, they're white hot overheatedness. People are leaving and looking for alternatives. But yeah, I mean, in general, no, I mean, real estate obviously should be a huge piece of this conversation. And there's a number of tech companies and a number of challengers who I feel are into it. But yeah, I haven't seen, a ton of, of the usual suspects get into it. I mean, one company I'm thinking of, for example, that is really interested, and I guess you would call them a real estate company, is, Reef Technology, backed by SoftBank. They acquired 4,500 parking lots and, are now really seizing the moment to turn those into some form of usable assets, starting with food trucks. Like, that's an interesting deployment of real estate and technology, and the pandemic and proximity, and that's a very fascinating use to me. And obviously, real estate's playing a huge role to me in a perhaps necessary at the moment, but ultimately not necessarily positive way, is of course the rise of ghost restaurants, dark cloud kitchens, dark retail, what the various delivery companies are doing by basically sort of disappearing stores and restaurants off the high streets. Thousands upon thousands of closures of small businesses in New York alone, for example, and moving them into the cloud, and when it comes to the interface, but then into hidden retail, into dead malls, into container restaurants that are tucked behind various places. It's a very interesting technological and business model response to the pandemic that's been accelerated by it. But I worry we're doing irreparable harm to the complexity of our cities by destroying so many small businesses part of that. So yeah, so I think real estate is being, these new players are being very opportunistic and being very smart about it. But yeah, this notion of, we need to think about hyper mixed use, and we need to think about what we need in our communities. no, I feel they've trailed well behind that. And there's all sorts of reasons, I'm sure, all sorts of pro forma financial models. Obviously, zoning is a huge piece of this in most cities. I mean, coming back to the residential and where we need to build housing and where we can't, and all those things. But yeah, you know, I'd like to see more leadership from the sector, frankly.
Thank you very much. Oh, I see. This is the trick. I can see, Devin, you've just
Yeah.
unmuted, which means you're about to jump in. But then I would like to.
I have something. I was just going to build on that and say that, you know, I think, you know, unfortunately, kind of historically, real estate and development has been like hugely, you know, like kind of first and foremost, you know, sort of driven by profit and driven by dollar signs. And I think we've learned, you know, kind of time and time and again, that it's sort of, as soon as you kind of lose sight of kind of the idea that sort of drove a real estate trend, and kind of looking at it exclusively through that lens, like it starts to fail and decline. And the example that I'm thinking of in my head that jumped at me was the cubicle, which, you know, in the workplace, the cubicle started as this really amazing concept called the action office in the 60s. That was really about connectivity and giving people like space. It was very similar to what we're talking about now, is this progressive idea of activity-based working. And that was where it was rooted in. And then, you know, once kind of real estate, you know, got a hold of it in terms of a concept, it sort of turned into the cubicle farm, and like, oh, well, now we can squish more people into the same amount of space, and now we can make things more efficient and we can save money. And then you quickly lose sight of the fact that the whole root of this solution was based in like kind of making people happier and making their lives better. And kind of it became just a financial play, and then boom, you create this horrible environment that people hate, which, you know, kind of ended up dying, and now we're still kind of learning from that. But I think when you look at real estate development in general, a lot of like the motive has been just about efficiency, just about cramming things in. And the more that we can use policy, and the more that just as consumers, we can just, you know, not give our money to people who are doing shitty things. You know, I think it's really one of the simplest ways that we can kind of affect change there, and really start to make developers be driven more by kind of cultural growth and by community happiness rather than just by profit. And that profit will come with those things rather than, you know, the other way around.
It's interesting because that sort of demand for happiness, I think, shouldn't be overlooked. It's incredibly important. But I think a lot will be driven by tenants, for example. I think tenants are going to demand healthy places to work. Tenants are going to demand access to more outdoor space, for example. So I think some of these demands will be driven by the needs of the consumer and by tenants of these buildings. So, and I think the other side of it may well be driven by the necessity to survive as a group. For example, a lot of the malls who are suffering, right? Many are surviving and doing well. Many are suffering. So one of the things that we're beginning to see is a kind of infusion of, again, this sort of hyper mixed use model, perhaps, where there's an opportunity to bring housing into that mix. And all of a sudden, it changes it from a sort of standalone entity into a community. And so you're building community around an asset that has huge tracts of land and seems to be an opportunity to build community around. And you're seeing that in housing. You're seeing that in even in the healthcare realm, where certain healthcare entities are thinking about this. So I think there's opportunity here. And again, it's going to be driven by, I think, the need, and by tenants and consumers, and by the need to survive and retain your assets. So I think there's going to be a need to really consider those portfolios.
Thank you very much. I mean, I think, you know, that comment you just made there, Roger, that the demand for happiness shouldn't be overlooked is brilliant. You know, that's a headline in itself, as is, you know, we should stop giving money to people who do shitty things. That's another good one from you there, Devin. And of course, we've got all of the, you know, we've got the frost and stuff from Greg as well. Now I am really torn, which is very sort of apt for a conversation, which is all about balance between this fantastic discussion, and we've also had some really fantastic questions through from the audience. You know, they're sort of really great, and so I'm kind of, you know, do we carry on the discussion, do we go to the questions? And I think it's always really good to engage with the audience. So let's go to some of these questions and just take a few minutes to go through some of those. Now, we've had a couple in actually around similar area, which is when we were talking about climate change and sustainability. It's obviously something that people feel very strongly about, and rightly so. So I'm going to kind of amalgamate them together into one question, because I think they're sort of saying the same thing or asking the same thing, which is how do we mobilize and incentivize the real estate industry to embrace sustainability and ESG? And that is something that I think we all know is one of those things that has been an issue way before this pandemic hit, and it's been accelerated and kind of made like more of an opportunity, but also more confusing at the same time. So Greg, let's start with you. In terms of how we can incentivize the real estate sector to promote sustainable development, what can be done?
Well, I don't know. That is a big question. A couple of things I guess spring to mind. So the report I mentioned earlier that just came out today from the Commodities Future Trading Commission, their top line recommendation is a carbon price in the United States. So, you know, which I thought was kind of apt coming from them. Make carbon a commodity and trade it like any other in a way, sort of. But yeah, I mean, obviously starting point where like, you know, you need hard financial and policy incentives to do that, or at least starting with a hard policy one. And then you also have, I mean, you know, again, when it comes to, you know, the energy perspective, like, you know, there you see the cost of renewables is falling below fossil fuels. And I know there was just a piece that came out where utilities are slow to get on board because of their own reticence. So, you know, the market is doing some things. We need a lot more policy responses to others. And then, yeah, I think to, you know, to Roger's point, I mean, you know, tenants will demand healthier buildings and some of the tech there. And the pandemic will, of course, drive all sorts of changes in the hygienics of buildings, the same way the flu of 1918 sort of inspired Bauhaus, which is a discovery where, you know, a connection we're rediscovering. So there's some of that. And then, yeah, and I think, you know, longer term, I mean, yeah, I guess a confluence of those things will drive some of the migration inland that I talked about. I mean, you know, so right now there's a combination, for example, of, you know, or there was the Trump administration's rolled a bunch of back in the United States. But, you know, but basically buyout programs to move people off the coast, thinking about more longer term regional plans. There's all sorts of ideas about creating, you know, regional commissions that, you know, can use a percentage of real estate sales to basically fund trusts that can then invest in resilience and adaptation efforts in places like that to build seawalls around Lower Manhattan, for example, or things like that. So there's some interesting sort of financial models at play you can do there. And but yeah, ultimately it's going to be about involving, you know, patient capital of this. And so I'm trying to put together an event for new cities on this. And yeah, I mean, I had an interesting email exchange today with Swiss Re. I mean, Swiss Re is talking about resilience as a service, and they're getting heavily involved with this because yes, you can imagine one of the world's largest reinsurers is very interested about what becomes uninsurable shortly. And people will be driven by the markets if we don't. You know, in California already, there's talk of the fact that, you know, that basically owning homes in Central California on the so-called urban wilderness interface, those homes will become uninsurable. And so therefore we'll be forcing people to move. So, so yeah, I think, you know, it's going to be a combination of carrots and sticks that drive them. And, you know, we have to, I think as members of the polity of the United States and other polities, we need to help drive some of those regulations, but, you know, the market will also nudge them as well. So that's the very short answer.
Thank you very much. I mean, I can see that Roger, it looks like you want to answer that too. So if you could just, I'm going to give you 30 seconds because, and then I've sort of like worked out which questions to put to which of you to get through as many as possible. But Roger, if you do want to comment on that.
I was just going to add that also, I mean, the long-term incentives for people that have long-term assets is it's going to save them money over time. If you invest in sustainable practices, you're going to save money. And I think that's a really simple formula that works for many developers.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So there's a question here, which I'm going to put to Devon, if that's okay, which is that one is from Dan Pitt. One element of dense high-rise cities is getting people there to work, and public transit has been essential. Now we have an aversion to riding on public transit because of the danger of airborne transmission of this virus. And the question, and this is a real killer, so apologies to put this to you, have we built truly unlivable cities?
Well, and that's what I was kind of trying to get at with my answer before is that, you know, I don't think we've built unlivable cities. I think, you know, on one hand, you know, we have to look at the virus not as like a everyday after today is going to be like today. You know, there's going to be a time when things, you know, change. Like, obviously we're going to learn as a society that we need to adapt and we need to be ready for this if it happens again and not be caught off guard like we were, which would, you know, be helpful if we had teams that were in place to sort of be ready to do those like we did previously. But I think that the answer is really about, it's about mixed programming. It's about like using policy in the government level to incentivize mixed use, to mix up residential and commercial, to to stop looking at like suburbs and urban centers as kind of, you know, isolated places, and start realizing that the same way that work has invaded home already, with, you know, via the smartphone, via the laptop, via, you know, the way that we work, you know, it might as well, you know, real estate might as well come along with it at this point, because it's kind of silly at this point to sort of not admit to ourselves that like these things are intertwining in a much deeper way than any previous generation has experienced, and that we need to just start to like adapt the way that we live and the environments that we live in to the way that we work. So, you know, I think the answer is not, you know, we do need to put more infrastructure into making subways and things more hygienic and more safe to use. But I also think we need to mitigate their use by kind of eliminating the need to commute for more and more people through the use of, you know, work from home, work from anywhere, third place, all these, you know, kind of policy changes around mixed use programming, that kind of thing.
Thank you very much. A great answer there to that question. And I've got one here for Roger now, which is an interesting one. And I want to put it to you, Roger. I think that you'll have a great answer anyway, but off the back of that, you know, the demand for happiness comment that you made, you know, if we take it right down to the base level, there's a question here on the crisis around mental illness and addiction in communities, and a need for a realistic solution in terms of effective mental health treatment along with safe and secure housing. Instead of the current situation, and the person that posed this question has referred to it as managed misery, which sounds, you know, horrendous when put like that. So how do we, you know, we're talking about how to make these cities of the future better, but how do we really make them better at that very, very fundamental level?
Well, I think the answer is community. I think we have to focus on our communities. I think we have to focus at the neighborhood level. We have to understand how, and that's why this sort of mixed use conversation is so important, because the idea of concentrating infrastructure, concentrating assets into a kind of mixed use of elements, which could also have their own sort of system of generating energy, or accumulating assets in order to benefit for this larger community. I think the answer is really community, because within that sort of, you know, that short distance, there's an opportunity to have the things you need, to get to the things you need quickly, and also to have the community support behind you as well. But that doesn't mean just buildings. That means infrastructure. That means connectivity between one neighborhood and another, and to the downtowns. It means having the kinds of assets that people need and want that are going to support that level of happiness that we're talking about. It also means open space, access to space and outdoors, that people can find relief from the confines of their apartments. And I think ultimately placemaking, creating something that has an identity in a neighborhood where people feel a part of something that they can gravitate to and that they can be proud of. And I think that's really a part of it. And I think much of what we've talked about today really embraces that idea.
Thank you very much. There's a question here that I just want to put to all of you quickly, and then we'll do some final thoughts. I can't believe that we've been chatting for nearly an hour, but we have. It's true. You know, well, we could talk about this for 6 hours, but I suspect we might lose some audience members if we did that. In real estate, we continue to see a mismatch between what the market wants versus what we have, and real estate and construction takes time. So do you think we can attract the type of talent in our industry that can, you know, really look ahead and can sort of, you know, lead change? And how do we attract talent that will challenge the establishment? Greg, let's start with you, and then go to Roger, and then Devin.
I say I thank you to Michael for that question. I cheated and looked into the Q&A there, so I know that's from Michael Beckerman himself here. And the short answer is I don't have an easy answer to that question. I just want to note there's a great irony in that question, in the fact of, you know, the COVID-19 pandemic has of course been a real-time life or death challenge to every government in the world on its ability to actually provide services to citizens. And so we've seen the value of incredibly competent technocracies, regardless of their ideology around the world. And so it's kind of ironic, right, that the United States has had perhaps one of the world's worst responses, and it's headed by a real estate family, you know. So, so yeah, this is what happens. This is what happens when the model of core real estate, run as family businesses with, a handful of close associates. So yeah, Michael's absolutely correct that we need to get more talent into the sector ASAP. How to do it is an interesting question. I'm not sure there, it is interesting, of course, that over the last couple of decades, we've seen the brightest minds of America go into finance and into technology with the promise of huge rewards. And I think this is obviously part of a larger value shift, really, if we're going to convince people to go into, real estate, obviously, huge profits, but yeah, changing these models of it and changing what it should be and working hand in hand with policy is going to be such a huge challenge of this. So I don't know. I could point to a handful of developers in this, but that is still very much idiosyncratic. People who've seen enlightenment. I'll defer to my other panelists here on how do we inculcate that, whether that's in education, whether it's in the culture of the business, something about the sort of grand narrative change, and you can see glimpses of it, ironically, from like Silicon Valley, right? Mark Andreessen came out of his bunker in April to write an essay on it's time to build. And then that entire spirit disappeared, right? We're going to build new institutions, we're going to build new things. And then Silicon Valley is like, actually, we're going to close our offices and we're all going to go work from home. So we'll see you later and never come back. So anyway, I'm riffing here, but yeah, it's obviously important that the narrative changes there. That this notion of building and one final point here. This is the kind of narrative that's advanced by the Green New Deal, and whether you agree with exactly their policy prescriptives or not, I like the fact that they're borrowing the notion of the New Deal from the 1930s to lay out the fundamental challenges, the kind of mobilization needed to make that happen. So we need a narrative. The journalist in me, we need a story, we need a narrative, and we need characters.
Interesting. Yeah, I think there's no doubt policy is a critical component of this, but I think in our individual places of impact, we need to reach out. And what I'm saying is we need to reach out to like-minded thinkers and collaborate and imagine what we can do together to make a difference. We actually have to build new models one by one for these kinds of things to make a difference. And I think that's a part of it. It's really mobilizing the incredible brain power that we can exchange ideas through Zoom and other media, but we can also come together to really make differences. So I think with our clients, I think we can collaborate. With other innovators, we can collaborate. But I think that's essential in actually developing models that make a difference, because we have to produce some of this stuff to make it visible to most.
Thank you very much. And Devin, finally, your thoughts on that questionnaire from Michael.
Yeah, so I started thinking about how WeWork, when it originally started 10 years ago, was really born out of the 2008 financial crisis and recession. And one of the big things that it sort of captured and provided a solution for was like the large number of people that were being laid off or were using the financial crisis as the excuse to finally, kind of say, what, I have an entrepreneurial idea. I have something that's been driving me, that's been, laying on the surface. And now this is the opportunity for me to kind of take it forward and sort of take that entrepreneurial leap. And a place like WeWork gave them kind of a, bit of a platform and environment in which to kind of to do that and hopefully, help bring success to some of those people. But I think right now we're at another one of these precipices where like we've had mass layoffs across the country and across the world. And I'm really, got my fingers crossed that a lot of them, like myself, are excited about the opportunity that's now in front of them rather than discouraged by the environment. And I think to some degree, as long as we can kind of open up and give more of a platform to sort of entrepreneurs that are now going to, kind of take and run on their own and give them an opportunity to be, disruptive and to kind of take the reins and we let them sort of make changes and kind of take us forward. I think that's one of the ways that we can kind of look. And those people are going to set good examples. What's going to happen is some of them are going to do a great job, and then everybody else is going to say, hey, wait, that works. Like now we can do it. And then hopefully that's how the real estate world, the construction world, which as Michael tested, are very resistant to change and disruption, they're going to be drug along by profits in the end. And as long as we set examples and people who are entrepreneurial can show that this will work, I think the industry will follow.
Thank you very much. There are some more questions, which is great. It's lovely to see the audience so engaged. We are out of time, so thank you very much for all the questions. I think there are a couple that are a bit specific to certain panelists, and I'm sure that they'll follow up with you somehow. I don't know, I'm just signing you guys up to following up after this discussion. But before we go, we've got 1 minute, but I might overrun by a minute or two. I hope that's okay. I just really want to just very quickly go back along the panel. Let's start with Devin, then Roger, then Greg. Final message to our audience today. What would you say to them? Like, if you could say it in 1 or 2 sentences, what is it you, I know, I'm sorry, I'm so horrible, particularly for Devin who's starting. What would you say? What's the message you'd leave people with?
I think make places that people want to go, and they will come. I think it's as simple as that. I think it's something that we lose sight of oftentimes in our industry, and we get wrapped up in regulations and in incentives and everything else. And I think if you go back to the root of like, who is our customer? It's the people who come to our spaces, whether you're a developer, a real estate agent, an architect, you know, it doesn't matter. Make places that people want to go, and they'll come. And I think if we all kind of live by that mantra, then the environment will be much better for everybody.
Very Field of Dreams there. I like it. Roger.
I think when we build, we need to build for community impact. So wherever we build and whatever we do, consider the place that's being built and try to have the greatest impact you possibly can. I think that would be my message.
Thank you very much. And Greg, finally, a message from you.
I'll just add that we're here to help. Obviously, you know, Devin and I here as part of the CREtech Consulting practice. Like, you know, if you're watching this and you want to get started in building yourself a 15-minute city, we're here to help. And obviously, Roger's here for his firm too. So I would encourage you to get in touch because, yeah, we are going to need exactly these kinds of connections, collaborations, cross-silo, everything to build this. I mean, part of the reason we haven't built this kind of world is because silos are very neat and they keep things very separate. And it's going to take a lot of elbow grease to actually sort of break this open and use this moment as an inflection point to build the kind of world we want. So please get in touch.
Thank you very much. Well, I'd like to take the opportunity to thank our panelists today. You've been absolutely brilliant. And, you know, it's such a brilliant discussion to be having, you know, from different cities around the world. And here in London, we need these conversations as much as anybody. So it's been really insightful for me. Thank you so much. And thanks to all of the audience members and our viewers for joining us. I hope you found it as interesting as I have. That's it from me. And I'm just going to hand over now to Benjamin, who is going to sort of close up the event. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. That's all I had as well. So thanks so much for joining. I really appreciate everyone's time. Have a good day.